In the final months of 1944, as the Second World War ground toward its bloody conclusion, something inexplicable began stalking the night skies over Europe. Something that would terrify even the most experienced combat pilots. Something that, to this day, remains unexplained. November 23rd. 10 o'clock at night. The sky above the Rhine Valley was ink black, broken only by a thin crescent moon and scattered clouds drifting across the stars. Lieutenant Edward Schlueter, a decorated veteran pilot from Oshkosh, Wisconsin, sat in the darkened cockpit of his Bristol Beaufighter, cutting through the frigid air above the Vosges Mountains. His mission to intercept German aircraft operating between Strasbourg and Mannheim, deep in enemy-controlled territory. Schlueter wasn't alone. Beside him sat Lieutenant Donald J. Meyer, the radar observer, his eyes fixed on the glowing green scope that was supposed to reveal any enemy aircraft within miles. Behind them, Lieutenant Fred Ringwald, the squadron's intelligence officer, peered into the darkness, searching for any sign of the Luftwaffe. They were part of the 415th Night Fighter Squadron, based at Dijon in south-central France. These men were hunters of the night, trained to find and destroy enemy bombers that prowled the darkness. They had faced death countless times. They knew fear intimately, but nothing had prepared them for what was about to happen. As their Beaufighter crossed the Vosges and descended toward the Rhine, its dark waters reflecting the pale moonlight, Ringwald suddenly leaned forward. His voice crackled through the intercom. Casual at first, almost curious. "I wonder what those lights are over there in the hills." Schlueter and Myers looked. At first, they saw nothing unusual. Then, emerging from the darkness off their left wing, they appeared. 8 to 10 brilliant orange lights, arranged in a row, moving through the air at incredible speed. They weren't flares. They weren't tracer rounds. They were something else entirely. The lights flew parallel to their aircraft, matching their speed of 200 miles per hour with effortless precision. They glowed with an intensity that reminded the crew of Christmas tree lights, pulsing with an eerie, unnatural luminescence. Myers immediately checked his radar screen. Nothing. The scope showed empty sky. He grabbed the radio, contacting ground control. Their response sent a chill through the cockpit. No radar contact. No aircraft detected in their vicinity. Schlueter, acting on instinct, banked the Beaufighter toward the lights. They vanished, simply disappeared, as if someone had flipped a switch. The three men exchanged glances in the dim cockpit light, their hearts pounding. Had they imagined it? Then the lights reappeared, farther away now, dancing in the distance like mocking spirits. For several minutes, this deadly game of cat and mouse continued. The objects would appear, then vanish, then materialize somewhere else entirely. They seemed to toy with the aircraft, performing maneuvers that defied every law of physics the pilots knew. And then, as suddenly as they had arrived, the lights disappeared completely. The sky returned to its normal darkness, broken only by stars and the faint glow of the moon. The only sound was the steady drone of the Beaufighter's engines. When Schlueter landed back at Dijon, he and his crew filed their report. Their squadron mates laughed it off. Combat fatigue, they said. Reflection from ice crystals. Maybe even moonlight, playing tricks on tired eyes. But Schlueter, Meyers, and Ringwald knew what they had seen. They had witnessed something that shouldn't exist. What they didn't know was that their encounter was just the beginning. Over the coming weeks and months, more and more pilots would report similar sightings. The mysterious lights would earn a name: borrowed from a popular comic strip of the era, Foo Fighters, and they would become one of the most enduring mysteries of the Second World War. But here's what truly terrified the pilots. These lights weren't just random phenomena. They seemed intelligent, purposeful. They followed the aircraft. They observed. They hunted the hunters. And nobody, not the Army Air Forces, not British intelligence, not even the most brilliant scientists of the age, could explain what they were or where they came from. To understand why these mysterious lights struck such fear into the hearts of battle-hardened pilots, you need to understand the world they were fighting in. The late autumn and winter of 1944 was perhaps the most desperate period of the entire war. The conflict had reached a fever pitch, and the night skies over Europe had become a killing ground, unlike anything in human history. The 415th Night Fighter Squadron had been formed in February 1943 at an airfield in Florida, where young pilots learned to hunt in total darkness using primitive radar systems installed in converted P-70 aircraft. By March of that year, they had shipped out to England, where the reality of their mission became brutally clear. They were given aging Bristol Beaufighters, hand-me-down aircraft from the Royal Air Force with thousands of hours already on their airframes and engines that had seen better days. In July 1943, the squadron entered combat over Tunisia, flying missions in the pitch-black Mediterranean nights. They hunted German Junkers Ju-88 bombers and fought against an enemy that was desperate, skilled, and utterly ruthless. By November 1944, when Schlueter and his crew encountered those orange lights, the squadron had relocated to Dijon in southern France. They were now flying the newest American night fighter, the Northrop P-61 Black Widow, a massive twin-engine aircraft painted in glossy black, equipped with cutting-edge SCR-720 radar that could detect enemy aircraft from 5 miles away in total darkness. But even with this advanced technology, night fighting remained the most dangerous job in the Air Force. Every mission was a lonely dance with death. A pilot would take off into absolute blackness, guided only by instruments and the ghostly green glow of the radar scope. There were no fighter escorts at night, no one to watch your back, just 3 men in a metal coffin, hunting other aircraft that were hunting them. The skies above the Rhine Valley in late 1944 were a battlefield frozen in time. Below, Allied armies were pushing toward the river itself, the last major natural barrier before entering the heart of Germany. The Wehrmacht was making its final, desperate stand. In December, Hitler would launch the Battle of the Bulge, throwing 200,000 men and 7 panzer divisions into a surprise offensive through the Ardennes. The Luftwaffe, though depleted and starving for fuel, still possessed deadly capabilities. German pilots flew Messerschmitt Me-262 jets, the world's first operational jet fighters, and the remaining Bf-110 night fighters prowled the darkness with their own radar systems, looking for Allied bombers to destroy. Between December 17th and 27th alone, the Luftwaffe would lose 644 fighters and 227 more damaged. 322 pilots would die, 23 would be captured, and 133 wounded. The sky was a meat grinder, consuming men and machines with industrial efficiency. For the night fighter crews, the psychological pressure was unbearable. They flew in complete isolation, often for hours at a time, knowing that at any moment a burst of cannon fire could tear their aircraft apart. Shell shock and combat fatigue were epidemic. Men who had been fearless warriors would suddenly break down, unable to fly anymore. Some would wake up screaming in the middle of the night, reliving dogfights that played out in total darkness, where death came as a sudden flash of tracers and then nothing. The Rhine Valley itself was a haunted landscape. For centuries, German folklore had spoken of spirits and demons that dwelled along the river. The Vosges Mountains were said to be home to witches and dark creatures. In peacetime, these were quaint stories told to frighten children. But in the midst of total war, with cities burning and millions dying, the line between myth and reality began to blur. The pilots of the 415th were young men, most in their early 20s, who had been thrust into a nightmare beyond imagination. They had watched friends die. They had killed enemy air crews who were probably just as scared as they were. They had seen cities reduced to rubble and civilians caught in the crossfire of armies. And now, in addition to everything else they had to fear, something new had entered their world, something that their radar couldn't detect, something that could outmaneuver any aircraft ever built, something that seemed to possess an intelligence and purpose all its own. The SCR-720 radar was supposed to be their guardian angel, their eyes in the darkness. It worked by sending out microwave pulses and detecting the echoes that bounced back from enemy aircraft. The system was revolutionary, giving American night fighters a decisive advantage over the Germans. But when those orange lights appeared alongside Schlueter's Beaufighter, the radar saw nothing. It was as if the lights didn't exist in the physical world at all. This was the crucible in which the Foo Fighter mystery was born, a place where exhausted men fought a war in total darkness, where technology pushed the boundaries of what was possible, and where the normal rules of reality seemed to have been suspended. In this environment, anything seemed possible, even the impossible. After that first encounter on November 23rd, Schlueter, Mayers, and Ringwald found themselves the subject of ridicule back at base. Their fellow pilots made jokes about them seeing things, about combat fatigue, finally catching up with the squadron's most experienced crew. The three men began to doubt themselves. Had they really seen those lights? Or had the stress of too many missions finally broken something inside their minds? But their doubt wouldn't last long. On December 15th, the 415th Night Fighter Squadron relocated to Ouchy Air Base in northeastern France, moving closer to the front lines as Allied forces pushed deeper into German-held territory. That very night, another crew encountered the phenomenon. The pilot's report was brief but chilling. He had observed a brilliant red light at 2,000 feet, traveling east at approximately 200 miles per hour, near the town of Ernstein. His airborne intercept radar had malfunctioned at the critical moment, but he followed the light visually until it simply winked out of existence. He couldn't get close enough to identify what it was before it vanished. 2 days later, on December 17th, another pilot was flying at 800 feet over Breisach, Germany, when his report would add a new dimension to the mystery. He spotted 5 or 6 flashing lights, alternating between red and green, arranged in a distinctive T-shaped formation. As he maneuvered his aircraft through turns, trying to shake them off or get a better look, the lights mimicked his movements perfectly. They followed him through every evasion maneuver he attempted, staying in formation as if connected by invisible wires. Then, just like the others, they disappeared without warning. But it was the encounter on December 22nd that would truly terrify the squadron and convince even the skeptics that something extraordinary was happening in the night skies over Europe. Lieutenant Samuel A. Krasny was on routine patrol when he spotted something that made his blood run cold. Flying just a few yards off his wingtip was an object unlike anything he had ever seen. It was cigar-shaped, with no visible wings or tail. It glowed with an intense red light that seemed to pulse with an inner fire. The object was so close that Krasny could see its surface in detail, yet it made no sound above the roar of his own engines. It had no markings, no exhaust trail, no visible means of propulsion. Krasny's voice crackled over the intercom, struggling to maintain the professional composure drilled into him during training. He ordered his pilot to attempt evasive maneuvers. The pilot threw the aircraft into a steep bank. The object matched them perfectly. He dove. It dove with them. He climbed. It climbed alongside. For several agonizing minutes, the glowing cigar stayed locked in formation, as if magnetically attached to their aircraft. Then, without warning, it accelerated away and disappeared into the darkness, moving at a speed that seemed impossible for any aircraft of that era. When Krasny returned to base, he was visibly shaken. This was a man who had survived dozens of combat missions, who had faced German fighters and flak batteries without flinching. But this encounter had rattled him to his core. The other pilots could see it in his eyes, hear it in his voice. Whatever he had seen out there, it wasn't a hallucination. On Christmas Eve, the Foo Fighters returned in force. Multiple crews reported sightings throughout the night. The squadron's war diary would later note that the phenomenon was particularly active during those dark December hours when the rest of Christendom was celebrating peace on Earth. The irony wasn't lost on the pilots. As reports accumulated, a pattern began to emerge. The Foo Fighters appeared in various forms. Sometimes they were spheres of light, glowing orange or red or green. Sometimes they appeared as cigar-shaped objects without any visible structure. Occasionally, they manifested as disc-like forms that rotated as they flew. Some pilots reported seeing them arranged in geometric patterns, perfect triangles or T formations that maintained their shape through complex maneuvers. Their colors varied wildly. The most common reports described orange or fiery red lights, but some crews saw green, white, or lights that seemed to shift between colors. In one particularly strange account, a pilot described lights that appeared to be communicating with each other, pulsing in sequence like some kind of signal. The size of these objects varied just as much as their appearance. Some were described as small as light bulbs, barely visible in the darkness. Others were reported as large as trucks, massive glowing forms that dominated the night sky. One pilot, flying over the Indian Ocean in September 1941, had described a strange globe glowing with greenish light, about half the size of the full moon. He and two sailors aboard the Polish merchant vessel Pułaski had watched it for over an hour, along with a British officer who witnessed its bizarre movements. But it was the behavior of these objects that truly defied explanation. They seemed to possess intelligence. They would approach aircraft, pace alongside them, and then perform maneuvers that were aerodynamically impossible. They would make turns at angles that would have torn any known aircraft apart. They would accelerate from a standstill to incredible speeds in seconds. They would hover in place, defying gravity and inertia, and they seemed to enjoy toying with the aircraft they encountered, appearing and disappearing as if playing some cosmic game of hide-and-seek. Yet, despite all this, the Foo Fighters never displayed hostile behavior. They never attacked. They never fired weapons. They never attempted to ram the aircraft they followed. They simply observed, followed, and eventually departed. This non-hostile behavior was perhaps more unnerving than an attack would have been. At least an enemy could be understood, fought against, defeated. But these lights seemed to exist beyond such human concerns. The squadron historian would later write that pilots were initially taunted by their buddies and began to wonder if they had developed combat fatigue. However, other crews began to report seeing Foo Fighters in the Rhine Valley at night. Thus, the Foo Fighters were definitely established as an existing phenomenon. Lieutenant Donald Mayers, the radar operator from that first encounter, gave the phenomenon its name. He carried a copy of the comic strip Smokey Stover in his back pocket, a popular cartoon of the era featuring a firefighter whose catchphrase was, "Where there's Foo, there's fire." After yet another encounter, Myers reportedly slammed the comic strip down on Ringwald's desk during debriefing and said, his voice tight with frustration and fear, that it was another one of those Foo Fighters. The name stuck. By the end of December, the phenomenon could no longer be ignored or dismissed. Too many credible witnesses had reported the same thing. These weren't inexperienced rookies or men suffering from combat fatigue. These were professional military aviators, trained observers whose lives depended on accurately identifying aircraft and threats. And they were all reporting something that shouldn't exist. The mystery deepened when intelligence reports revealed that German and Japanese pilots had been reporting identical phenomena. If these were Allied secret weapons, why would they appear over Japanese-controlled Pacific Islands if they were German weapons? Why would Luftwaffe pilots report being followed by them? The possibility that these were some kind of secret weapon from either side began to seem increasingly unlikely. On New Year's Eve, a war correspondent named Robert C. Wilson arrived at the 415th base to investigate reports of the mysterious lights. Wilson was an Associated Press reporter who had covered the European theater extensively. He had planned to fly along on a night mission to see the phenomenon firsthand. But weather conditions kept all aircraft grounded that night. Instead, Wilson spent the evening interviewing the pilots and crew members, listening to their accounts, studying their faces as they described what they had seen. What struck Wilson most was the pilots' demeanor. These weren't men prone to fantasy or exaggeration. They were, in his words, very normal airmen whose primary interests were combat, pin-up girls, poker, donuts, and other typical soldier concerns. They weren't the type to make up stories or seek attention. Yet every one of them he spoke to was absolutely convinced that something real and inexplicable was happening in the skies over Europe. The next day, Wilson filed his story. By January 2nd, it appeared on the front page of the New York Times and newspapers across America. The headline spoke of mysterious balls of fire that Allied pilots couldn't explain. Wilson quoted Myers extensively, describing 3 types of these lights that the crews had encountered. Red balls of fire that appeared off wingtips and flew alongside aircraft. A vertical row of 3 balls of fire that flew in front of planes, and groups of about 15 lights that appeared in the distance, arranged like a Christmas tree floating in the sky. Myers' final quote in the article would become one of the most haunting statements of the entire phenomenon. They don't attack us. They just seem to follow us like will-o'-the-wisps. Will-o'-the-wisps. Those ghostly lights from folklore that were said to lead travelers astray in marshes and swamps, luring them to their doom. The comparison was apt and deeply unsettling. The story created a sensation. Suddenly, the Foo Fighters were front-page news across America. Theories proliferated wildly. Some suggested they were German secret weapons, perhaps some kind of radar jamming device or psychological warfare tool. Others proposed natural explanations, from ball lightning to St. Elmo's fire to reflections of searchlights off ice crystals. Still others, particularly after the war, would suggest something far more exotic, visitors from another world, observing humanity's most destructive conflict. But the newspaper articles and official reports couldn't capture what it was truly like to encounter these things in the darkness, thousands of feet above enemy territory, completely alone. Lieutenant Wallace Gould's experience would become one of the most terrifying accounts on record. It was a moonless night over German airspace, the kind of darkness so complete that you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. Gould was flying patrol, his eyes scanning the instrument panel's faint glow, when something appeared alongside his aircraft with such suddenness that his heart seemed to stop. A brilliant light materialized directly off his wingtip, so close he could have reached out and touched it if the fuselage hadn't been between them. The light was intensely bright, yet it didn't illuminate the surrounding darkness in the way a flare or searchlight would. It simply existed, a sphere of impossible radiance hovering in the void. Gould's first thought was that a German jet had somehow snuck up on them. Perhaps some new aircraft equipped with landing lights to confuse Allied pilots. His hand moved toward the weapons controls, adrenaline flooding his system. But as his eyes adjusted to the light, he realized there was no aircraft, no structure, no wings or fuselage. Just the light itself, pulsing with an inner energy that seemed almost alive. The light followed his aircraft for several seconds that felt like hours. Gould could feel his pulse hammering in his temples, his breath coming in short gasps. Then, without warning, the object shot upward with such velocity that it seemed to simply vanish. Later, when Gould tried to estimate its speed, he calculated that it had climbed more than 20,000 feet in a matter of seconds. No aircraft in existence could perform such a maneuver. The G-forces alone would have killed any human pilot. When Gould returned to base, his hands were still shaking. He told investigators that he had initially thought it was some kind of jet-propelled aircraft pursuing them. But, he emphasized, they had been very close to the object, close enough to see every detail. And none of them saw any structure on the fireball whatsoever. Try to imagine what these men were experiencing. Picture yourself in that cockpit. You're flying alone in absolute darkness. No moon. No stars visible through the cloud cover, just you and two other men in a metal tube. The only sound, the constant drone of your engines and the crackle of the radio. Your entire world has shrunk to the dim glow of your instrument panel and the ghostly green sweep of the radar scope. You're hunting. That's your job. You're looking for enemy bombers, trying to shoot them down before they can drop their deadly cargo on Allied troops or French civilians. You've done this dozens of times. You know the fear that comes with combat. The way your stomach clenches when you hear the call that bandits are in the area. You've seen friends die, their aircraft spiraling down in flames. You've killed men yourself, watching through your gun sight as your cannon rounds tear into enemy aircraft. But this is different. This is something your training never prepared you for. Suddenly, your radio operator's voice cuts through the intercom. Contact 11 o'clock. You look. At first, you see nothing. Then they appear. 8 glowing spheres. Orange like molten metal. Arranged in a perfect line. They're flying alongside you. Matching your speed, exactly. 200 miles per hour. Matching every movement. You check your radar. Nothing. The scope is clear. You call ground control. They see nothing either. The rational part of your mind starts racing through possibilities. Flares, no. Flares fall. Weather balloons, no. Balloons don't fly in formation or keep pace with an aircraft. Enemy fighters, no. The radar would see them. And besides, why would they just fly alongside you without attacking? You make a decision. You bank hard toward the lights, ready to engage if they're hostile. They disappear, just like that. As if someone flipped a switch. Your heart is pounding so hard you can hear it in your ears. Then they're back. But now they're behind you. How did they get behind you? You never saw them move. They just ceased to exist in one location and reappeared in another. You try to shake them. You dive. They dive with you. You climb. They climb. You perform a barrel roll that pushes your aircraft to its limits. They match the maneuver perfectly, as if they're attached to your wing by invisible cables. And then you realize something that makes your blood run cold. They're playing with you. These things, whatever they are treating your aircraft like a toy. They're not trying to shoot you down. They're not even being hostile. They're just observing, following, studying you like you're a specimen in some cosmic laboratory. This realization is somehow more terrifying than if they had attacked. An enemy you can understand. An enemy you can fight. But this is beyond comprehension. Minutes pass. Could be 5 minutes. Could be 15. Time loses meaning when you're this afraid. Then, as suddenly as they appeared, the lights are gone. The sky returns to normal darkness. The only sound is your ragged breathing and the steady drone of the engines. You return to base. You file your report, and you know, with absolute certainty, that you'll never forget what you saw. You'll never forget that feeling of being watched, studied, hunted by something that exists beyond the boundaries of everything you thought was possible. Richard Ziebart, the historian for the 417th Night Fighter Squadron, would later interview many of these men. He noted that the pilots were very professional. They gave their reports and talked about the lights, but they didn't speculate about them. These were trained military observers, men whose very survival depended on accurate identification of threats. They reported exactly what they saw, nothing more and nothing less. But Keith Chester, a researcher who would later write extensively about these encounters, got closer to the truth when he interviewed pilots off the record. One pilot from the 415th, speaking candidly decades after the war, described his feelings during an encounter with a single word that captured the raw terror of the experience. He said he was absolutely terrified, using language too colorful for official reports but brutally honest in its simplicity. By March 1945, the situation had become serious enough that the 415th Night Fighter Squadron's reports reached the highest levels of military command. The 12 Tactical Air Command forwarded their concerns to the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force in Paris. SHAEF, in turn, contacted the British Air Ministry in London, seeking any information or explanation for the phenomenon. The Air Ministry's response, dated March 13, was both revealing and frustrating. They acknowledged that Bomber Command crews had been reporting similar phenomena for some time. They suggested that a few of the alleged aircraft might have been Messerschmitt Me 262 jets, and for the rest, they proposed that flak rockets were the most likely explanation. But then came the admission that would haunt investigators for decades. The whole affair was still something of a mystery, and the evidence was very sketchy and varied, so no definite and satisfactory explanation could yet be given. In other words, the highest levels of Allied command had no idea what these things were. In the spring of 1945, as the war in Europe entered its final, desperate months, Lieutenant Colonel Chamberlain, a special aide to General Hap Arnold, commander of the Army Air Forces, arrived at the 415th Night Fighter Squadron's base on temporary assignment. His mission was to investigate the Foo Fighter reports firsthand and determine whether these mysterious lights posed any threat to Allied operations. Chamberlain interviewed dozens of pilots and crew members. He examined radar logs and flight records. He studied weather reports and astronomical data, looking for any conventional explanation that might account for the sightings. What he found would form the basis of an official investigation, a comprehensive report that would supposedly explain everything. But here's where the story takes a strange turn. That report was lost after the war ended, simply disappeared from military archives. Whether it was misplaced in the chaos of post-war reorganization, deliberately suppressed, or destroyed, no one knows. The investigation's findings vanished as mysteriously as the Foo Fighters themselves. This left researchers, scientists, and the pilots themselves to develop their own theories about what they had witnessed. Over the decades since the war, numerous explanations have been proposed, ranging from the mundane to the extraordinary. The most immediate assumption during the war was that the Foo Fighters were some kind of German secret weapon. Germany had, after all, produced revolutionary aircraft like the Me-262 jet and the rocket-powered Me-163. They had developed the V-1 flying bomb and the V-2 rocket. Weapons so advanced they seemed like science fiction. Perhaps the Foo Fighters were another example of German technological ingenuity. Some kind of radar jamming device or psychological warfare tool designed to unnerve Allied pilots. An Italian author named Renato Vesco would later champion this theory, claiming that the Foo Fighters were actually a type of ground-launched, jet-propelled, automatically guided anti-aircraft weapon called the Feuerball, or Fireball. According to Vesco, these weapons were designed to interfere with Allied aircraft systems and create fear and confusion among bomber crews. But this explanation had fatal flaws. First and foremost, the Foo Fighters never attacked. They never caused any damage to aircraft. They never interfered with engines or electronics. They simply followed and observed. What kind of weapon observes without destroying? Second, after Germany's defeat, when Allied intelligence teams interrogated captured Luftwaffe officers and scientists, examining thousands of documents and technical specifications, they found no evidence whatsoever of any Feuerball program. Most damning of all, German and Japanese pilots reported seeing identical phenomena. If the Foo Fighters were German weapons, why would they appear over Japanese-controlled Pacific islands? Why would Luftwaffe pilots report being followed by them over their own territory? The secret weapon theory collapsed under scrutiny, leaving investigators to explore natural phenomena as possible explanation. One popular hypothesis suggested that the Foo Fighters were actually St. Elmo's fire, a weather phenomenon where atmospheric electricity creates a luminous plasma discharge around pointed objects. Sailors had reported seeing St. Elmo's fire on ship masts for centuries, describing it as a glowing blue or violet light that appeared during storms. Aircraft could experience similar effects, with electrical charges building up on wingtips and other protruding surfaces. But the pilots who had encountered Foo Fighters immediately rejected this explanation. Many of them were familiar with St. Elmo's fire and had seen it during flights. The colors were completely different. St. Elmo's fire glowed blue or violet, while the Foo Fighters were typically orange, red, or green. More importantly, St. Elmo's fire was stationary relative to the aircraft, appearing on the aircraft's own structure. The Foo Fighters flew independently, performing complex maneuvers that no electrical discharge could possibly execute. Another natural phenomenon proposed was ball lightning, mysterious glowing spheres that occasionally appear during thunderstorms. Ball lightning was poorly understood in the 1,940 seconds and remains somewhat mysterious even today. Witnesses have described it as lasting for several seconds, moving erratically, and sometimes passing through solid objects before dissipating. Yet ball lightning typically appears only during stormy weather. While many Foo Fighter sightings occurred on clear nights, ball lightning rarely lasts more than a few seconds, while Foo Fighters followed aircraft for minutes at a time. And ball lightning doesn't arrange itself in geometric formations or respond to aircraft maneuvers. Perhaps the most dismissive explanation suggested that the pilots were simply hallucinating due to combat fatigue. War is extraordinarily stressful, and the psychological toll on combat pilots was immense. Night flying added another layer of stress, with pilots operating in complete darkness, often for hours, with constant threat of enemy attack. Could the Foo Fighters have been nothing more than the product of exhausted, stressed minds, seeing patterns in random lights or misidentifying stars, planets, or reflections? The pilots themselves found this explanation insulting and unconvincing. These weren't inexperienced recruits, prone to panic or imagination. These were professional military aviators, many of them veterans of dozens of combat missions. The American Legion magazine reporter who interviewed the 415th described them as very normal airmen whose primary interests after combat were pin-up girls, poker, and donuts. They weren't the type to see things that weren't there. Moreover, multiple crew members witnessed the same phenomena simultaneously. Radar operators saw what pilots saw. Intelligence officers confirmed the sightings. Were they all hallucinating the same thing at the same time? In 1953, 8 years after the war ended, the Central Intelligence Agency convened a panel of 6 distinguished scientists to investigate the Foo Fighter reports as part of a broader examination of unidentified aerial phenomena, known as the Robertson Panel, after its chairman, Caltech physicist Howard P. Robertson. This group represented some of the finest scientific minds in America. They reviewed military reports, interviewed witnesses, and examined every conventional explanation that had been proposed. Their conclusions were frustratingly vague. They suggested that the Foo Fighters might be electrostatic phenomena similar to St. Elmo's fire, or electromagnetic effects, or perhaps simply reflections of light from ice crystals in the upper atmosphere. But they offered no definitive explanation. They couldn't explain how ice crystals could follow aircraft through complex maneuvers, or why electromagnetic phenomena would appear as distinct objects rather than diffuse glows. The Robertson panel's report essentially concluded that they didn't know what the Foo Fighters were. More recently, in 2024, researchers from the universities of California and Arizona, along with Harvard-Smithsonian scientists, proposed a fascinating new theory. They suggested that the Foo Fighters might be plasmas, the fourth state of matter, distinct from solids, liquids, and gases. Plasmas are ionized gases that can exist in the upper atmosphere under certain conditions. These researchers argued that plasmas can exhibit properties that make them appear almost alive. They can grow, replicate, make contact with each other, and may even feed off electromagnetic radiation from satellites and spacecraft. According to this theory, the electrical fields generated by aircraft could attract these naturally occurring plasmas, causing them to follow planes and respond to their movements. The plasma's ionized nature would make them invisible to radar, which requires solid objects to produce echoes. Their ability to rapidly form and dissipate could explain the Foo Fighters' sudden appearances and disappearances. It's an elegant scientific explanation, and it accounts for many of the reported characteristics. But it still leaves questions unanswered. Can natural plasmas really maintain coherent forms for minutes at a time? Can they arrange themselves in geometric patterns? Can they accelerate from stationary to incredible speeds instantaneously? The plasma theory is compelling, but it's not conclusive. Then there are the explanations that venture beyond conventional science into the realm of the extraordinary. After the war, as the modern UFO phenomenon emerged with the famous Roswell incident in 1947 and thousands of subsequent sightings, many researchers began to view the Foo Fighters as early evidence of extraterrestrial visitation. The technology displayed, the seemingly intelligent behavior, the global nature of the sightings, all suggested something beyond human capability or natural phenomena. Could the Foo Fighters have been visitors from another world, observing humanity during its most destructive conflict? Were they reconnaissance probes sent by an advanced civilization to study our primitive warfare? The timing is suggestive. The Foo Fighters appeared during a war that saw the first use of jet aircraft, guided missiles, and ultimately, atomic weapons. Perhaps this technological leap attracted the attention of beings monitoring our planet's development. Or perhaps the explanation lies not in outer space, but in other dimensions. Some theorists have suggested that the Foo Fighters were manifestations from parallel realities, briefly intersecting with our own. This would explain why they seem to exist, partially outside our physical laws, why radar couldn't detect them, why they could appear and disappear instantaneously. They weren't breaking the laws of physics in our dimension because they weren't entirely in our dimension. The folklore and mythology surrounding the Rhine Valley offers yet another perspective. For centuries, German legends spoke of spirits and supernatural beings inhabiting the river and its surrounding mountains. In a region steeped in such traditions, some wondered if the Foo Fighters were something older than modern warfare. Ancient entities disturbed by the massive conflict raging across their territory. So, what are we left with? More than 80 years after Lieutenant Edward Schlueter first spotted those orange lights off his wingtip above the Rhine Valley, the truth is, we're left with the same mystery that confronted those young pilots in the winter of 1944. We have hundreds of credible reports from trained military observers. We have official documents acknowledging the phenomenon. We have investigations that reach the highest levels of Allied command. And yet, we have no definitive answers. The Foo Fighters represent something profound about the nature of war and human experience. They remind us that even in humanity's most documented conflict, even with thousands of observers and all the technology of modern warfare, there are still mysteries that elude explanation. The night skies over Europe in 1944 were perhaps the most scrutinized airspace in history, patrolled by aircraft equipped with the latest radar, observed by countless ground stations, fought over by the most technologically advanced militaries ever assembled. And yet, something appeared there that none of that technology or expertise could identify. Consider the deeper implications of this mystery. Those pilots were young men, most barely out of their teens or early 20s, thrust into a conflict that killed more than 70 million people worldwide. They watched cities burn. They saw friends die in flames. They killed enemy air crews who were probably just as frightened as they were. They lived with the constant knowledge that any mission could be their last. That death could come as a sudden burst of cannon fire in the darkness. In that context, the Foo Fighters took on a significance beyond their physical nature. They became symbols of the ultimate powerlessness that war imposes on those who fight it. These pilots were masters of the most advanced technology of their age, flying machines that represented the pinnacle of human engineering. Yet when confronted with these mysterious lights, all their training, all their equipment, all their courage meant nothing. They couldn't engage them, couldn't outmaneuver them, couldn't even understand what they were. They were reduced to spectators of something beyond their comprehension. War doesn't just destroy bodies and cities. It destroys certainty. It destroys the comfortable assumptions we make about reality. For those pilots, the appearance of the Foo Fighters shattered one more illusion that the universe operates according to rules we understand, that the night sky follows physical laws we can predict. Instead, they learned that even in the midst of humanity's most organized violence, there are forces and phenomena that remain stubbornly, terrifyingly mysterious. The official investigations that followed the war tell their own story. The fact that Lieutenant Colonel Chamberlain's report was lost suggests either remarkable incompetence or deliberate suppression. The Robertson panel's failure to reach any definite conclusion, despite having access to some of the brightest scientific minds in America, indicates that this mystery genuinely stumped the experts. The British Air Ministry's admission that the whole affair remained unexplained reveals that even at the highest levels of military command, no one knew what was happening. Perhaps that's the most unsettling aspect of the Foo Fighter phenomenon. We want to believe that mysteries can be solved, that sufficient investigation and scientific analysis can explain anything, but sometimes reality refuses to cooperate with our desire for answers. Sometimes, the evidence points in multiple directions, or in no direction at all. Sometimes, we're forced to live with uncertainty. Today, Most of the men who witnessed the Foo Fighters are gone. Edward Schlueter passed away decades ago, taking his memories of that November night to the grave. Donald Myers, who gave the phenomenon its whimsical name, is gone. Fred Ringwald, who first spotted those lights over the hills near the Rhine, is gone. The vast majority of the 415th Night Fighter Squadron's veterans have now joined their comrades who fell during the war, but their testimony remains. Their official reports sit in archives. Their interviews with researchers like Keith Chester preserve their accounts, and their experience poses questions that continue to haunt us. What were those lights in the night sky over Europe? Were they natural phenomena that we still don't fully understand? Were they evidence of technology far beyond what possessed in 1944? Were they visitors from elsewhere, observing humanity at its most violent? Or were they something else entirely? Something that doesn't fit into any category we've yet imagined. The plasma theory proposed by modern researchers offers a tantalizing scientific explanation, but it remains unproven. We still can't replicate the behavior these pilots described in laboratory conditions. We still can't fully explain how natural plasmas could exhibit such apparently intelligent behavior. The extraterrestrial hypothesis captures the imagination. And it's true that the reported characteristics, the incredible speed, the impossible maneuvers, the apparent intelligence, all suggest technology beyond anything humans possessed in 1944, or perhaps even today. But without physical evidence, without any attempt at communication, it remains speculation. The possibility of secret weapons, either German or Allied, has been thoroughly investigated and found wanting. No documentary evidence has ever surfaced. No scientists or engineers have come forward with deathbed confessions. The secret weapon theory appears to be a dead end, which leaves us with an uncomfortable truth we don't know. After 80 years of investigation, analysis, and debate, the Foo Fighters remain as mysterious as they were on that November night in 1944, when Schlueter, Myers, and Ringwald first encountered them. But perhaps the mystery itself is the point. Perhaps the Foo Fighters serve as a reminder that even in our age of surveillance, satellites, and quantum computers, even with all our scientific understanding and technological prowess, the universe still has the capacity to surprise us, to show us phenomena that don't fit neatly into our categories and explanations. War is supposed to be the ultimate human activity, where we control every variable, where strategy and technology determine outcomes. But the Foo Fighters intruded on that organized violence like uninvited guests at a funeral, reminding everyone involved that humanity's conflicts, for all their horror and scale, are still small events in a much larger, stranger universe. So here's the question that lingers. The question that those pilots took with them to their graves. Were the Foo Fighters a truth that was hidden from us, buried in classified files and lost reports? Or were they simply something that humanity, even at its most technologically advanced, wasn't ready to understand? Sometimes, late at night, when you look up at the dark sky, remember that 80 years ago, young men flew through that same darkness and saw something that defied explanation. They were hunting in the night, masters of their craft, equipped with the finest technology their civilization could produce. And something hunted them back. The lights that followed them through the darkness were never explained. The mystery was never solved. The truth, if there is a truth, remains hidden in the night sky, waiting, just as it waited then. Just as perhaps it waits still, watching, following, observing humanity's endless conflicts with an intelligence and purpose we may never comprehend. The Foo Fighters came from the darkness, and to the darkness they returned, leaving behind only questions, fear, and the testimony of men who witnessed something that shouldn't exist. Do you believe it was a hidden truth? Or just stories whispered by soldiers in the midst of hell on Earth? The choice is yours. But remember this, those pilots believed, and their fear was real.